Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. My name is Vally Morford. I'm Director of Design Jam, and I was CEO of Co-Design Studio, a placemaking enterprise based here in Melbourne, while they were constructing Collingwood Yards. So we were here, placemakers in residence, for 6 months, and it's quite extraordinary to see the changes that this precinct has undertaken in the last, 2 years. It's been a huge change. And now we don't need to fill our kettles up in the toilet sink anymore, so yes. So it's lovely to have so many of you here. I'm sure there'll be a bit of people wandering in and out. The reason we have microphones is because we're live streaming. That means we'll be clearly understood to those who are at the other end of the camera right now. So welcome all of you who are, I'm sure there's thousands of them, who are joining us at the other end of the internet right now. So I'm going to be the host. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to be the interviewer today. So I have some pre-planned questions. We've been for coffee. We've planned our questions, but we're also going to throw questions open to the audience. So if you do have anything dawn on you that you're really bursting to squeeze in, I'm sure that our wonderful authors will be willing to kind of like let you sneak questions in here and there. So if you're desperate for one, let me know and I'll get you in. So welcome to our fabulous authors. Can we just model the book quickly? Sure. So we have wonderful co-authors of this fabulous new book, Living Outside. This is a book that has never been more relevant, as we've been through 12 months of challenging times in Melbourne and other cities. Who here is from Melbourne? Yeah, 3 lockdowns. I didn't see your hands come up. You're both so lucky. Obviously not from Melbourne. But I'd love Sharon Mackay, I'd love you to introduce yourself.
Pleasure. Thank you, Vally. And I've known Vally for, 25 years or more. We both went to RMIT to study landscape architecture. So thanks, Vally, for stepping in today at what I must say is short notice because of Brisbane COVID restrictions, or the current ones. This is actually the first time we've spoken about the book, despite it having been on the shelf since October. We are so thrilled to be here and being able to talk about it. We're so thrilled to be together again, and also a few of the projects that are in the book, the designers of those projects are also here. Welcome, Simon and Paul. I'm a landscape architect by profession, and this is my first go at writing a book, and I think the most exciting part of it was that I was able to co-author it with Di Snape, who's a long-time collaborator of mine. I'm from Adelaide. I cannot be happier to be in Melbourne today. It's the first time I've been on an aeroplane and left Adelaide in over a year. So I'm probably a little bit more excited than usual, just because I've left the state, which is amazing.
Yeah, there's something very appropriate about us being able to finally talk about this book in Melbourne, of all places, because I live in Sydney, and it's been the place where Sharon and I come together to escape and talk about the things that we want to do together outside of our normal daily lives. And so my normal daily life, I have architecture training in my background, I have film and television production in my background, I have theatre performance in my background, and this is my first book writing foray as well, and I think really it is an expression of the way that we work differently when we work together, and we think differently when we do it together. So it's really fantastic to be here, and thanks, Vally, for being here with us, and to all of you as well.
So this is not your first collaboration. I'd love it. Di, can you shine a little light on where your collaborative journey started?
I sure can. And so for a long time I was living in Adelaide as well. That's where Sharon and I met, and we were working together and undertaking a whole bunch of different projects in the context of the Government Architect's Office down there. And so we were there at a time when there was a great optimism in South Australia, I would say. There was a huge energy behind urban development and innovative thinking, and it was being championed by the Premier at the time, whose name escapes me because he left the day that I arrived.
Stephen Yarwood?
No.
Jay Witherell.
Before Jay. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The politicians. The point is that there was all of this investment going on in the urban development of Adelaide, and that particular condition gave us the opportunity to do things like design and host public exhibitions of architectural work and engage in public conversations about the design of urban spaces. And so that's really what led us to a collaborative practice together.
And then we decided that work wasn't enough, and we've done quite a few collaborative projects, including being the inaugural curators of the Institute of Landscape, or the Landscape Architecture Festival, which we did was based in Queensland at the time. That was an amazing long journey and process, and was I think if I could summarise the process that Di and I go through on any extracurricular activity, it goes along the lines of me coming up with a silly idea and saying, Di, this is just crazy, we can't do this. And she says, well, that's not crazy. It would be really crazy if we did this. Oh my gosh, okay, let's do it together. So we've been each other's cheerleaders for a while, and I don't think any of the work that we've done would have been anywhere near as successful unless we were doing it together, particularly curating and writing a book. I think many minds are better than one, of course. And for us, most importantly, we learnt so much from the designers of the projects that we went to see. We researched. Each was individually quite extraordinary, and I certainly hadn't quite expected how much learning on the ground we would have, and how that we could then translate that into the book itself.
So what was the catalyst for this book now?
So one of the projects that I was working on at the time was hosting the television show called Australia by Design, which was on Channel 10, and there was a landscape series of that program. We were having a very short period of time to communicate what was interesting about each of these quite extraordinary landscapes and gardens, and the people that created them and the people that occupied them. And you'd get a soundbite, and that was it to communicate what was important. And that was frustrating. And Di and I were concurrently sort of observing a resurgence in or revival, in fact, of people being more interested in outdoor spaces and the way we live, and Di's work was focusing on that a lot, and we began talking about how interesting it would be if we could talk about it in a form that was in a written form and in a book and through photographs.
And that whole time while you were presenting that TV show, I was constantly on the phone to Sharon, who was saying, they won't let me talk about this stuff, and I really want to explore these ideas, and why can't I get it out? And so when she said, this is a stupid idea, we should write a book, I said, it's not really, because you've done it already in your head. So I think that there was a lot of that thinking that happened in the process of, the other work that we do and have done is reflected in what we've written in the book.
So let's jump into some of the themes from the book, and let's jump into sort of the history narrative there. I was interested in, and perhaps we'll start with you, Sharon, how did post-war nationalism, the desire to tame nature and the wilderness, how did that contribute to the evolution of modernist gardening here in Australia?
And there's been theses and PhDs written about that. However,
which neither of us have written.
That's right. But effectively what was happening around the world was a understanding of landscapes being one of two things, one or three things really. One was either the wilderness, the wild, the productive garden or the agricultural garden, so for human use, or sort of show gardens, so the European show spaces for folly or promenading or flowers, or you know, it was a very particular, very constructed landscape. We had adopted that in Australia when you know, for most of the time until the Second World War, when so many people had to change the way they lived. We began to look at the Australian landscape with a new reverence, and not necessarily to tame it, but just to understand that what we considered to be wild was actually not at all. It was something that you could get great benefit from and joy from, and begin to use it. So that nationalism that came post-war, I think, kind of led to a whole different view of the way that we considered landscape, gardens, and the way we occupy space. In fact, there was a whole lot of concurrent things going on, changes in technology, changes in you know, the way we live in our houses, the way that we interacted with each other and went to work, all changed as well. So it was, international modernism had a different effect internationally. We had a very specific response to it in Australia.
Yeah, adding to that, Di, I'd love to hear your take on how building design and interiors and you know, daily experiences and the way we lived, how was that evolving as well? Because that was very much part of the evolution, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think, you know, sort of it's a bit of a leap into the mid-20th century in Australia, but I think with a rapidly expanding urban context, suburbs being developed all over the country, a kind of an egalitarianism to that, and families having access to their own gardens, to single-family dwellings, enabled and was an expression of a desire to live in those kinds of communities, in those kinds of conditions. And I think at the same time there was an exploration of what it meant to work within the Australian landscape, and I have no doubt that Paul can speak to this in much greater and more accurate detail than I can, but practitioners like Ella Stones and Edna Walling were writing in magazines, so the equivalent of our current day social media, or say watching Grand Designs. There was access for people to ideas about how to work with the Australian landscape, with Australian plants, how to create a specifically Australian identity, and that was also being played out on the larger stage with the design and development of Canberra, which was explicitly about developing an identity, an urban identity for Australia, being our national capital. So this not all happening exactly at the same time, but it is very much a confluence of ideas, which I think probably gained momentum at that point in a post-war period. And that, and we were talking about this earlier, I think there's an extent to which feminism and the liberalisation of women and the way that they lived and worked effectively in the home changed the interior design of houses, the arrangement of kitchen spaces, living spaces, bedroom spaces, the connection of those things to outdoor spaces, partly because of the climate that we enjoy here and the fact that that's possible in a way that is not necessarily possible the rest of the world. So I think that those ways of living influence very much the arrangement of spaces, and consequently the way that we occupy and design and consider ourselves in those outdoor rooms.
Obviously, this was not a time where social media was available. How did you do your research? What was the actual materials that you used and you based a lot of your research on?
We began to, we already had some favourite spaces that we wanted to talk about, obviously, but we did quite a lot of research with Julie Collins at the Architecture Museum at the University of South Australia. A collection that they have And we all know this resurgence of modernism. Everyone's talking about modernism from an architectural perspective. So there was actually quite a lot of material available around architecture. But the museum has a huge collection of the most wonderful material, which brings to mind things like Home Beautiful, Homes and Gardens, which were these incredible reflections of popular culture at the time and really reflect the changes that we were experiencing. So not dissimilar to social media, those magazines were coming into the homes of women. People were reading about, exploring using Australian plants and the joy that you'd get from, say, a kangaroo paw flower, through to the importance of connecting inside and outside, the importance of having, a patio to have a meal on rather than staying inside, and importantly being able to open up the homes and let light in, and gardens became, or the garden room, as Di mentioned, it was very much part of that connection. So a lot of it was just the interest that we were taking at the time in reading and being across a lot of other material.
I do think, though, and you started the question by mentioning social media, that helped.
Yes.
The fact that we can access, images of contemporary projects like your projects, that we can look quickly across, historic projects as well, that has enabled our conversation to continue as well. And I think it's really worth mentioning that context that we find ourselves in, it sounds a little bit lightweight when you compare it to serious PhD research, but I think it's what we all use when we're looking for inspiration. We're looking for our what's that app you use to pin things on? Pinterest. Yeah, we all use that too, and I'm sure your clients often come to you with, this is my Pinterest account, so that's what I'd really like to have. I think that that does change the way that we all practice and the way that we perceive contemporary practice around us. So it's not nothing, the influence of social media in the way that we work together.
I just have this beautiful vision in my head of you going to the State Library and putting on your cotton gloves and just leafing through magazines from the 1960s, 1970s.
No, it was actually quite the opposite.
Spending your weeks doing that in preparation for your book. It's a really delightful vision.
It was hardly.
Sorry to burst the bubble.
No, in fact, it involved lots of hotel rooms with using the bed to kind of put our A4 layouts out on the table, and doing a lot of talking in the car on the way to some site. And I also specifically remember the very first day I went into the Architecture Museum feeling like I needed to wear white gloves. I actually took in a coffee, asked if it was okay for me to take a coffee, and then managed to spill my coffee over, luckily, just my belongings. I was so embarrassed. I was so embarrassed that I'd never be invited back to the space again, because it just smelt like coffee as well. And I haven't... to prepare for today, I actually pulled out a folder that I'd used for the first time since that day, and it just smells of coffee still. So
it would be remiss of us, though, to not mention the fact that, yes, there was the research that we did early on, but being in the gardens themselves and speaking to the designers and to clients, and having the advantage of Christopher Frederick Jones's amazing photography and his capacity to see those spaces, that is really the source material.
That's one of the questions I was about to throw to. So he is a well-known architectural photographer. Did his own kind of lens, how did his own persona even influence what's in the book today?
So when we first contacted Christopher, CFJ, we knew him through his photography. He's often graced the covers of popular magazines, Houses and Architecture Australia, and we had him pinned on our Pinterest, and we're so grateful that he decided to said yes and wanted to come on this crazy idea with us. He as we began to know him, we discovered that he actually had a background in landscape architecture. He just didn't talk about it very often. He has an absolute love for design. It was often difficult to get him away from the projects that we were photographing because he was too interested in chatting to the designers or the owners of these places. And he also has a background in wildlife photography. So his ability to see places through a lens, which is different to the way we would experience space, was just another opportunity for us to be able to communicate what was important. And we didn't have to do much to direct that process. In fact, it was almost the opposite, that he directed us in lots of ways to look at spaces in a different way, and it was really kind of the joy of the project. And I think, looking at the book, which is hard to do objectively, but I really think that the photography is absolutely the thing that brings all the projects alive, and you kind of look at it a different way. It's not about the landscape around the house or around the architecture. It's actually a lot of photographs of the gardens where you don't even see the house, because it's really important that we look at gardens as themselves, except obviously where the importance is the connection between the two of them. And that was really interesting. A couple of times when we went to a site at the very beginning, he'd set up his tripod and start, imagining a shot with the house and the garden around it. And I'd say, well, let's just turn it 180 degrees. And he'd go, oh, okay. And so it was very quick relationship building to work out how we were going to express what we wanted to talk about in the book through photography.
Yeah, and I think it also changed the way that we understood those places. I'd say that, we started by thinking about this notion of a revival of modernism in the contemporary garden design, but then that was really a point of departure, and it was sort of the background really once we got amongst these places and began to understand what they're actually doing now in the life of the families who live there and in the practice of the people who design them. So that's what became much more our focus.
One of those random kind of thoughts. Did you have? I'm thinking about the three of you interacting with each other. Were there many kind of moments or places or snapshots or visuals which you had alternate views on? This is really important. This needs to make the cut. No, this doesn't need to make the cut because we're trying to focus. Did you have any of those moments?
No, Di and I agree with each other all the time.
That's not true.
No, and often the decisions were made by the publisher and not even us. Having said that, the Thames and Hudson as a publisher were amazing, and our commissioning publisher was excellent. She really stood back and let us create what we wanted to create. But on occasion, it was the project itself that kind of lent itself to, change my opinion of how we should present it. It was each of us looking at it with our fresh eyes, and of course, Chris had very different views even to to us. But I'd say generally it was quite easy. I don't think
it was a case of disagreeing with each other. I think because we trusted each other in the various different perspectives that we each bring to it. And if Christopher was here, he would say, always trust your photographer.
That's right. And I think it also helps. Di and I, sorry to flip back to the beginning of the conversation, but Di and I have had very similar professional and personal lives. We both grew up around landscape in rural or semi-rural settings, and both have a long history of having parents who, we both had parents who had copies of Alice Stone's book on the shelf and Grow What Where, and some early understanding and education around how landscape played in our lives. So we came to the book with fairly similar perspectives on what we wanted to talk about, and we fairly quickly were able to narrow down this big topic into the types of projects that we really wanted to visit and experience into the 3 chapters in the book, Designing the Wild, which was all about exploring projects that had used native plants as the palette and to explore and to use growth as a and the changing nature of plants as a topic. We also, the second chapter in there, if you haven't seen it, is about form and place, and the third one's around gardens for living in. And the projects aren't about the fanciest and nicest or largest projects at all. We were really conscious of being able to express the ideas through projects that really talk to that particular topic. So, for example, Simon's project around the corner in Abbotsford has 4 square metres of garden. That's it. And I find that absolutely extraordinary that could have such a strong narrative around and a contemporary kind of view of how we live with gardens as Paul Thompson's project, which is how many hectares? 5 hectares?
The compound is about 3 hectares, and the whole garden's about 5.5 hectares.
So slightly different projects,
Which
scale.
garden, so the audience knows?
Oh, sorry. So Paul Thompson designed in the project in the book, amongst other things. Obviously, Paul is designed projects as important as the Botanic Gardens in Cranbourne, and the project that he's designed that's featured in the book is called Red Rocks. It's down in Anglesey, and it's an extraordinary experiment of sorts that has went from that stage through to fruition and is still growing and is, I imagine, changed even since we were there a couple of years ago, and is now they're doing more, I think, around trying to use that site for further research.
Reached a level of stasis, actually.
Oh, good.
Yeah, which is where we want to be.
Yeah, great. And I understand the client spent quite a lot of the owner of the house spent quite a lot of their time during lockdown on the site and was able to immerse themselves in that space where they typically wouldn't spend much time there, or as much time. And Simon's project in the book is called Abbotsford Vertical Garden, although I don't think that's the term that you refer to it, but it's more than a vertical garden, I would suggest, and it's probably the smallest by scale project in the book.
So we live in a post-COVID world. We do. COVID happened. Our lifestyles have changed, especially Melbourne. So a number of people here from Victoria, 3 lockdowns. It felt like all last year was lockdown, didn't it? Certainly did to me. And I felt like I was one of the lucky ones because I'm living in Northcote. I have a front yard. I have a backyard. So for those 3 lockdowns, I was able to still sit in my garden, feel the sun on my face, immerse myself in my little garden, plant my tomatoes, do all those things that, make me feel like I've got a full and functioning life. That wasn't everyone's experience. So I'd love to hear from both of you your take on the changing role that gardens have in our lifestyle and as part of our well-being after having gone through something like COVID. So how has COVID changed our world?
I think that, so as Sharon was saying, because we both work in this urban condition and we're observing these, the trend towards increasing density in urban areas, that's where we work, that's where our employment comes from. Valley, you're probably in the same position. We're conscious that our personal relationship with gardens from our childhoods onwards has been kind of a privileged one. Not everybody gets the access to that kind of outdoor space, and it is something that we're both professionally and personally concerned with. How do you find opportunities to bring people together, encourage community, enable appropriate rest and relaxation and spaces for kids to play, spaces for old people to play. I think that the contribution of green open space, of tree canopy, of biodiversity, all of those things make an enormous contribution to the health and well-being of all citizens. And in the area of urban policy and urban planning, that is often at odds with the imperative which drives a lot of high density development, which is to ensure the greatest yield is achieved. I know that, the architects who are meeting those sorts of briefs are often challenged by how do they fulfil their obligation as architects to provide the best outcome for the most people and to ensure that they're responding to the public good. I think it's really difficult. So I think that garden spaces, particularly the generous and experimental and the even the small and the experimental, but equally as generous, have a huge role to play in that health and well-being of our urban communities.
And I don't think it would be incorrect to say that that's effectively what happened during that post-war modernist period. Was we explored new methods of placing gardens and green space. We developed the technology to do a flat roof. Rooftop gardens became a thing during that period of time. Particularly relevant to Melbourne, the flat, not the apartment building, but the flat where it had, open space as part of the communal living, arrived in Melbourne during that period of time. And then, postmodernism and, in that period of time leading into the 80s and 90s, we kind of just ruined it. We completely forgot about all those benefits of communal gardens and spaces and rooftop gardens and using technology to create new opportunities. We really, flourished with cash but didn't actually do anything particularly, to follow through those things. So what we were trying to talk about in the book, I think, and hopefully you can see it through each of the projects that we selected for it, was how that period, the principles that came out of that period, are now being explored again and really are providing people with inspiration. We wrote the book before COVID. We photographed it through floods, fire, smoke, and then eventually got stopped by COVID in March. And so it's extraordinary that the book exists even in the first place in that sense. But I think we're now with the benefit of having experienced lockdowns, we can look at these projects with even a different lens to say how absolutely what was just a inkling is actually kind of very clear now, that we don't have a choice. We have to be able to provide everybody with some equitable space and green space regardless of what you own, and how important that is going to be even into the future. And it's absolutely achievable. But we have to design it and make policies to ensure it, and that's probably not at the top of the agenda for a lot of our development at the moment.
Ironic to be talking about that when we're sitting here in Collingwood, a suburb well known for having a very low percentage of open space available, one of the lowest in the city, in fact. Okay, I've got just a few more questions and then we're going to open it up to you all, so start thinking about what you're going to ask. So I really want to hear for each of you, what were your favourite projects that you visited? What were the projects that actually really surprised you and really got the emotions flowing?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
The project that I have the most affection for, because it's like not saying that you've got a favourite child when we know everyone does, was actually the... Come on.
This is why I'm worried about answering the question.
The project that was actually in the book proposal in the very first instance was a project in Queensland designed by Dan Young, a landscape architect who I had come across when I was doing the television show and had visited the site. It's in Paddington, Queensland. Tropical modernism is very different to what we'd consider modernism down in the south. But the garden rooms that he created and gave respite for the family to be able to exit the street and come into their almost compound and use that to facilitate their indoor-outdoor life was probably the catalyst for even in the beginning of the book and starting to think about it. So for me, right from the very beginning, I said that it has to be in the book. It had to be in the book. We had a couple of cancellations of shoots, and there was a potential for it not to be, but we sort of just kept pushing. And I think that it's a privilege to know that the project that you most loved at the beginning remains that at the end. So,
Di?
It's really, there are two standout experiences, and I want to talk about it in relation to the experience of being in those gardens rather than kind of having a favourite project, because they all have really different qualities. But the experience of going to Lundasang up in Federal in the Byron Bay hinterland, I mean, that is really hard to beat. That was extraordinary, and not just for the garden, not just for the amazing architecture by Crofie, but because of the fact that the owners of the place are slowly buying up more land and planting more forest to repopulate the land with tropical forest, and I just think that that's an amazing thing to do, and I'd love to do that when I grow up. The other one, which really was an amazing experience, was the project called Twinset in Sydney, and the reason I say that is because the owner there was really keen to have a sensory garden, because her work as a wine taster means that her palate and all of her olfactory senses are highly developed, so she has a capacity to appreciate her garden through that way. You don't get that when you look at the pictures of it, when you scroll through social media, as we do a lot of the time. But understanding that the thinking behind the design and the choices of plants was about what you smell and how you feel as you come into this place was just fantastic. It was just such a lovely thing to do. And she has great dogs. So, a little bit biased on that front.
And last question before we throw it open to the audience. What sneaky ideas for collaborations do you have in the works? Can you let us in on a secret?
I don't know how to answer that.
I would say anything that allows us to be in the same town at the same time.
Being here is, again, I already said it once, it's amazing. We don't know yet. We know it's going to pop up, and there's musings about another book, and I think, like all good projects, you don't know them until you see it.